Good afternoon. A little bit later in this conversation today, I'm going to teach the men in the audience how to make a vegetarian curry that can certainly please your spouse or girlfriend. And so I'll be talking about that later. I'm just giving you this image as a starter on that. So anyway, here we are. And this week I received a rather, for me, shocking criticism from one of my good friends that has been following me now. I've received a criticism from one of my good friends who's been following me now for a couple of years. And so I want to acknowledge that criticism and make you aware of it and make you aware that I agree with it, and I also want to amplify it a bit. And so the first thing, what's fair is fair. When you make a mistake, then you have to own up to it. And so I'm going to read to you the criticism that I received from one of our fellow subscribers here. And then I will read to you my response to him. And then I'll amplify that a little bit. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the definition of metaphysics so that we're clear about that in this group. And then I'm going to read you something about the shadow so that you can understand the shadow in the context of Jekyll and Hyde or Faust. And finally, I'm going to leave you with a thought about the Faustian sin, which Dr. Jung talked about. And so, first of all, I'm going to read to you the criticism that I received, and I will take comments in chat if you're so inclined. So here's the email that I received yesterday. Hi, Skip. I have been watching most of your videos for the last few months, and I have a few things to bring to your attention. The most important is probably the idea of the God image that you talk about, and in general, your interpretation of God and religions. For example, in the latest seminar, you talk with Bill and Miles that there is not a God out there, but a God inside, and there are as many gods as human beings exist. You mentioned that there are 8 billion gods. In other videos, you talk about religions being just... In other videos, you talk about religions being just systems of mental hygiene. I understand the Jungian view on the self and its religion-creating archetype, but if you remove the validity of the metaphysical God that is out there, then you basically destroy the God image, because there is no God. The human psyche is a phenomenon created by our evolved operational system. What we call the ego is just a high-level software running on the low-level software that is the unconscious. Everything becomes materialistic and limited and lacks any meaning. It may create the illusion of meaning, but that is just a trick. There can't be 8 billion gods. There can only be one God by definition. In the Western tradition, man is created in the image of God. He is not God, but he is created in his image, and he has an immortal soul made by God. He carries a part of God inside him. If there are 8 billion gods, you have stripped the word God completely of its meaning. You can say that there are 8 billion slightly different software variations of the human psychological software. Nothing godlike there, nothing special or inspiring, just a bunch of apes driven by an ancient evolving biological code. If you are going to have a God image and to live a religious life oriented by the God image in a true way, then you have to have a real belief in the metaphysical God that is outside of you. Be careful when you talk about God, because you might destroy the God out of the God image. God is dead in the outside world, and God is dead in the inside world, because God does not exist. The conscious ego cannot submit to and obey a fake God. That leads to an atheistic inflation and a dissociation between the ego and the self. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that you have a very unbalanced view on the political situation. You are clearly identifying with one side of the opposites and are attacking the other side at every occasion. It is not a problem that you have your views, but you are presenting them as the final verdict, as a diagnosis of the problem, and in a very one-sided way, to the exclusion of the other side. You talk about the president as if you have intimate knowledge of his life and his psychological development. If you think about it seriously, you may find that most likely you have no real knowledge of his personal life and difficulties, neither the skills and training to give a diagnosis, but you never skip an occasion to tell your viewers how infantile the president is. Here's another example. When you talk about Trump, you many times compared him with Hitler. Not directly, but you say something like, Trump wants to start a war very badly, but so far he was prevented by the limitations of the political system. But as we know, Hitler did not start World War II immediately. It took him X years. Would you talk about Obama in that way? So far, you and I have not heard, So far, I have not heard you say a bad word about the Democrats and a good word about the Republicans. That is pretty one-sided. It is not like the Democrats are all good and Republicans are all bad. There is plenty of corruption on both sides. Be careful when you speak about the political opposites, because so far you are identifying with the Democrat view and are condemning the Republican. That goes out of the political sphere into the personal. We see nowadays political candidates suffer vicious personal attacks on their character that almost always come from the left-leaning media. Every Republican candidate is depicted as a racist, sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic, etc. The political situation is deteriorating very rapidly. You are alienating a huge part of your audience that does not share your political views. You are indirectly telling them that all of their political leaders are horrible human beings and that their ideas and politics are fueled by hate, greed, and lust for power. I urge you to rethink how you present your political views on your channel. Try to balance them out and not be so one-sided. We are not looking to repress the other side, but to reach a compromise and a conjunctio. I hope you don't see this letter as a personal attack or with bad intentions. That is not my point. I feel that it is important for me to give you my honest feedback so you can hopefully make some improvements. I appreciate your work on this channel very much, and it was very helpful for me. Best regards, and then the subscriber's name, which will remain anonymous. So I responded in part. I'm not going to cover the personal aspects of my response, but the aspect that relates to this criticism is as follows. Dear subscriber, many thanks for your courage, patience, and erudition in drawing me up on my shortcomings. It is a bucket of water over my head. It is a bucket of cold water over my head, but you are correct. I am forced to agree with you entirely and will do my best to make a major course correction. May I have your permission to read this into a video without mentioning your name? Please continue to criticize as you see more problems with my presentations. This is very helpful. And then I went on, and I did receive permission, which is why I read this to you now. Okay, so I do agree with these points, and I think that going back into, let's see, when would it have been? It was going back at least into the summer of 2017 when I started to read Answer to Job. I do agree that I took a rather arrogant attitude because I said, well, I'm not a theologian, so I don't have to toe the theologian line, and I'm not a psychologist, so I don't have to toe the psychology line, so I'm just going to give it to you what I think. And I think that I was mistaken, okay, because what is clear is that Dr. Jung, throughout his oeuvre, was very clear that he was never speaking about the metaphysical God. And Dr. Edward Edinger, whose work I have followed closely also, was very clear that he was not talking about the metaphysical God. And so I do agree that God is the one, and God is ineffable. And so, and let me say something that's a little bit clearer also. I had an epiphany when I saw Dr. Jung's video where he was asked, do you believe in God? And his answer was, I have no need to believe, I know. And in that moment, I suddenly had a kind of religious experience when I read that I too know. But when that came to my head, just as I was watching that, I said, okay, so what does he know and what do I know? And so very much of my research and my attempts to convey Dr. Jung's oeuvre over the last 2.5 years on this channel, and the last 8 years, including the Archetype in Action website, has been to get my mind around so that I could describe it to others what I know. And the problem is that if you have not had a true religious experience, as I believe I have, and a couple of my experiences were captured on video, and many of you have seen them. If you haven't had an experience like that, it may be very hard to understand what it is. And so, you know, Dr. Jung had this famous reference to the duck-billed platypus, and he said you can, you know, write whatever you want in zoological textbooks, but you're not going to capture or be able to describe what it's like to be a duck-billed platypus. And so God has been described by humanity for thousands of years. Probably at least we have 8,000 years worth of records where God is described by someone in some way. And many of those ways differ. What I like about Dr. Jung's oeuvre is that he drew a circle that drew all of those different ways in. And I remember I'm going to draw you a picture here. When I was practicing law years ago, I used to go into family court sometimes. And in the family court, I'm sorry I didn't make a beautiful shot of this before, but in the family court was a poster, and it had this image on it. And there was a caption under this poster, and the caption read, you drew a circle that drew me out. I drew a circle that drew me in. Or, I'm sorry, let me re-say that. Here's the image. You drew a circle that drew me out. I drew a circle that drew you in. This isn't high R, obviously, but so I drew a circle that drew you in. And in my view, I mean, that was obviously a numinous moment when I saw that poster in the family court. And because I'm remembering it now, I guess 30 years later, 35 years later maybe. But that's how I regard Dr. Jung's oeuvre with respect to all other religions and all views about God. His perspective was so broad that it allowed room for everyone. And that's what I think is intended by the metaphysical God. But I don't know, because I don't directly know anything about the metaphysical God. Now, Dr. Jung talked about the God image in the psyche as the deepest archetype in the psyche. He also called it the self. And Dr. Edinger also called it the greater personality. This is a psychological function within every human being. And so when I have talked about millions of God images, I have meant that archetype which appears in every human being. And Dr. Jung considered him a scientist and could prove that archetype empirically, and did prove it over 50 years of clinical psychological practice with he said at one point that he had investigated or analyzed 80,000 dreams. And so for my lights, and I've been doing this for 31 years, or I've been studying his work for 31 years, so I'm convinced that he was right. But, each person has to come to their own realization about such things. And so my point is that the God image manifests in different people in different ways. And what Dr. Jung said is that the human psyche cannot differentiate between the God image, their individual God image, and the metaphysical God. Again, I believe him on that. But when he says that, he is not saying anything about the metaphysical God per se. He says that the metaphysical God is ineffable, and therefore he's not trying to impinge on the bailiwick of theologians or philosophers or whoever. And one of the points that Dr. Edinger made in his 1994 interview, which you can find on YouTube, it's called Edward Edinger, An American Jungian, 1994. If you find that video, you will hear more or less the same thing as I'm saying now. So, in any case, thank you, Thomas. Thomas says, I disagree with your critic, though I've not listened to every bit. It seems to me you have bent over backwards to be fair and non-judgmental. Well, I do my best, okay? And on the political material, you know, I do acknowledge that I let my political views bubble through from time to time, and I make no secret about the fact that I am not a Republican, and I don't apologize for that. And there was one part of this that I missed one. Okay, I actually don't remember reading this particular paragraph or sentence in my friend's email, so I want to read it again. Let me read it again, because this is an important point and important to what we're talking about. He says, you are alienating a huge part of your audience that does not share your political views. You are indirectly telling them that all of their political leaders are horrible human beings, and their ideas and politics are fueled by hate, greed, and lust for power. I urge you to rethink how you present your political views on your channel. Try to balance them out and not be so one-sided. We are not looking to repress the other side, but to reach a compromise and a conjunctio. Okay, it's that last bit that I want to comment on here. There's a bit of a difference between a compromise and a conjunctio. And when we talk about conjunctio, we're talking about within wholeness having two different points of view, okay? And I think I've been quite clear that, you know, when I was in active service in the Marine Corps, for example, and I served both the regular and reserve Marine Corps for 23 years, it never occurred to me to think of the political position of the man standing next to me. Never occurred to me at all. And in fact, political activity in the U.S. military is not allowed. It's a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And so the conjunctio that we're talking about when we're doing something like that is that we're all Americans, whether we're Democrats or Republicans or whatever. And, you know, back in my day, which was when I was on active duty, was from 1968 to 1971. And during those years, racial tensions were very high in the United States. 1968, I went on active duty just 2 months after Martin Luther King was killed, and I went on active duty 1 week after Robert F. Kennedy was killed. And so racial tensions at that time in our country were very high. And I remember the Commandant of the Marine Corps, making it very clear that in the Marine Corps there is no black or white. All Marines are green. And, that was a numinous moment for me too, because we have, and always have, or have had for a long time since the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces, we've had a lot of people of different racial backgrounds in the Marine Corps, and there's just no place for racial issues among Marines. We're all green, and we're all trained in a certain way, and we know what we have to do. And things were very tough earlier on for Black Marines, and I had the privilege a few months ago to do an honor salute for a Black Marine first sergeant who was in the process of dying. He was, I sometimes do honor salutes on behalf of Hospice of the Chesapeake, and I actually acquired a new dress uniform so that I can do so because I'm a retired lieutenant colonel from the Marine Corps. I have the privilege of wearing my uniform anytime, and so with that privilege comes the privilege to thank my fellow veterans before they die, and to recognize the importance of their service. And on this particular occasion, this first sergeant had been the last man out of Moffett Point. Now, Moffett Point was a Marine Corps installation which was set aside only for Black Marines. And this first sergeant had closed Moffett Point. And so what we do, and I have the honor of also being with the active duty first sergeant of one of the two companies at 8th and I, which is at Headquarters Marine Corps. And he also came for this small ceremony that we do to thank veterans for their service before their death. And this Marine first sergeant had in his home absolutely amazing photographs of him with some of the leaders of the Western world. And because he had the courage to serve in the Marine Corps before the Marine Corps was integrated, and the courage to go through that transition, that transformation, psychological transformation that we all had to go through in order for all Marines to be green, he really saw it all. And so it was my honor and privilege to be a part of his honor salute. And I have no idea what his political philosophy is or what he thought about anything other than being a Marine. So anyway, but my point is that the conjunctio is about an alchemical idea, and the conjunctio means that there is a vessel And in many of our cases, the vessel is us, okay? We're the physical vessel. And we have to take in all the inputs from whatever source, and within our alchemical vase, it's like putting in all the different chemicals that you might do on a chemistry project, but we're putting these ideas into our psyche, and they go round and round, and then we take a position, and that's the conjunctio within us. And then within our organizations, whether it's our church or our Boy Scout troop or our city, state, or nation, or humanity itself, again, we are part of an alchemical process that has to work itself out. And so our national and international debate goes on our current affairs channels in the United States every single day. But the conjunctio does not mean that we are castrated. It does not mean that we become inert if we take in two sides of the opposites into our alchemical vase, ourselves. It does not mean that we become inert. We do not. Okay, we don't change that part of ourselves. And so each of us has to make our own judgment about what we think about any given situation. And so, anyway, the point is that when there is a conjunctio, as in Dr. Jung, his last major book was called Mysterium Conjunctionis, which means the mystery of the conjunctio. He was not saying that if we bring opposites together, that all problems will be solved and everything will be la-di-da across the earth. It won't be. But the process of individuation is about understanding both sides of a debate and seeing ourselves from both sides and trying to understand what that means. Now, once you are in the individuation process, once that's constellated in you and you start to evaluate it, then you have to make a judgment, okay? And that's a moral judgment. It's a moral judgment within you. And in the case of our president, I do acknowledge that I was very against him at the beginning, but I started to understand. I've been criticized for talking about politics on this channel before, and I have tried to control it. Let me see if I can cut my shades here a minute. I seem to be getting a nice set of lines across my face. That's better. Okay, so, but I have been trying to put myself in his place and put myself in the place of Brett Kavanaugh, for example, who's this week's soup du jour. And if I do that, in fairness, I have to say that many of the decisions that our president has made in his lifetime, I would also probably make given different circumstances in my life. And it is true that I sent jobs overseas. That's no secret for anybody who's looked at my LinkedIn channel page. And, that I'm not going to defend that, but I have been a part of the military-industrial business for many years, and I see it in a different way now as a Jungian, and I'm trying to understand that. I don't claim that I understand everything. I'm not the end-all be-all here. If you want the end-all be-all, please go read Dr. Jung's works directly. I'm only trying to help offer a way into it, because I know the material is difficult, and it has been very difficult for me over the years. And so I'm not, and if I think about what has gone on with Brett Kavanaugh in the last week, I have to acknowledge that all of us, whether we're men or women, there's a point at some stage in our adolescence where we have to learn about sexuality. And I'm not saying where the right point is or whatever, but certainly anybody that grows up and ultimately becomes a parent has to enter into maturity and to enter into knowledge of what the other sex is. And, the days, I remember, I think it was my mother said to me at one point that her grandfather never saw her grandmother naked in his lifetime. He never saw her naked. And so I'll let your imagination run with that one. But, today we have a different perspective on the world and on ourselves as animals. And I do want to address that a little bit more a little later in this presentation. But anyway, let's see. Okay, so Thomas says, the theological criticism seems remarkably similar to the letters to Jung you've been reading, where people with a certain viewpoint to defend demand of Dr. Jung that he conform to their view of God. One can't be all things to all people. Was your upset critic perhaps disturbed by recent events? I can't recall you ever demeaning Republicans, and only rarely do I recall direct mention of Trump. As a matter of fact, except for reading your response there, Thomas, I don't mention the man's name, but each of us has to search our own heart for what's right and moral in our adulthood, our mature adulthood, and the mature adulthood of our countries and humanity itself. Sean says, that was a very cool story, thanks. I recently was reading about Vietnam. I do think we all learned from it. We need sophisticated balance. 100% agree with this. Republicans and Democrats, I watched that. And this is sort of an intuitive question, but was yesterday a stressful day? Well, I would say that the last week has been a stressful week for me. And I'm not going to go into it in detail right now. Suffice it to say that I've been involved in a litigation for 8 years where I have had to do all the litigation on my side of the aisle. And it's been quite a task, and it's drawing to a close, and I do intend to talk about it at some point, but I'm not going to do that today. Okay, so having said that, I want to clarify what metaphysics is, because we have not, we haven't directly addressed that, and so let's talk about metaphysics and the metaphysical God in the context of metaphysics. So I looked it up on the internet, and I found a site called the Urban Dictionary. So I'm going to read some definitions from the Urban Dictionary. So this person says, I, as a philosophy major who actually studies this stuff, will post a real definition of metaphysics, since many definitions are bullshit for the most part. There are two kinds of metaphysics: general metaphysics, which is universal, and special metaphysics, particular. General metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality as in the big picture of reality, and is done empirically by most contemporary philosophers. Items of study in general metaphysics are categories, universals, and attributes, etc. It is not necessarily the study of any afterlife or upper reality. That subject is a matter for special metaphysics. Universals by D.M. Armstrong is a good example of what general metaphysics is. Special metaphysics has potentially an infinite number of sub-branches, each studying one particular subject. One such subject may be ghosts and spirits, but most contemporary philosophers don't take this particular subject matter seriously. Topics that are taken seriously are philosophy of the mind and psychology and personal identity and aesthetics. Unlike physics, which studies concrete objects, metaphysics studies abstract objects like mathematics, logic, etc. 1. In a hypothetical situation, Ray Comfort says, I call my paranormal investigation metaphysics to sound scientific. Most metaphysicians don't take your definition seriously. General metaphysics. Do two red blocks share a universal property of the color red, or do they have their own instance of having the color red? That is to ask, is there a universal thing called the property red that exists in more than one place at one time, and is there no such thing? Okay, I'll leave that. Okay, just one other thing I would add to that is that when Dr. Edinger was talking about Jung and the way Jung thought of himself, he thought of himself as a scientist, and he worked and talked about himself in that way throughout his lifetime. And he asserted that the things that he found in the clinic were empirical and therefore scientifically shown. Now, the issue for Jungian psychology is that it does not work the way the normal scientific method does. In the normal scientific method, you hold all variables but one constant, and then you try to solve for X, and that gives you some sort of certainty about what you're looking at. And, even Newton did that. And it turned out that he wasn't quite right about gravity, but nonetheless, it's still referred to as Newtonian physics, even though Einstein showed that, that the space-time continuum is more like a membrane than direct activity. Okay, so anyway, the point is that in order to appreciate Jungian psychology, you first need to believe that the psyche exists. And Dr. Jung said in paragraph 751 of Answer to Job that if that were not the case, then either the laboratory equipment or the uranium itself created the atom bomb, which it didn't. And if you look at everything in this screen behind me, every single thing in the screen behind me, and everything in your room with the exception of potted plants, everything is a product of the human psyche. Okay, even this shirt, somebody had to design this shirt and engineer how it was going to be produced, etc. And that's true of every physical object in the world. And that is all the product of the human psyche. And, the raw materials didn't do it. Okay. And then in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job, Dr. Jung said that every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche. It's not a statement of the physical world. So as soon as you start insisting that what is in the Bible is physically true, then you are depreciating the metaphysical God, because there's other than maybe historical events, there's very little in the Bible that is physically true or can be proven to be physically true. And certainly when you start talking about Yahweh and those things, so we're talking about religion. Yes, religion is a system of mental health, and they were spontaneously developed. Every religion was spontaneously developed to answer a need of human beings. But saying that doesn't have anything to do with the metaphysical God. I acknowledge that I am wrong when I say that it is God. I don't want to say that. I don't know anything about the metaphysical God. And like Dr. Jung, I have no need to believe. I know if you have had a religious experience such as the ones I have had over my lifetime, and I have them very often, then including at least 3 times in the past week, if you have had experiences like that, then you no longer have to question at all. Okay. Now, one of the important points that Dr. Jung made, well, let me come back to that. I wanted to talk about this shadow issue, and this does involve a discussion of some current information and current affairs information, but let us look at it from the point of view of Jungian psychology, and specifically with respect to the idea of the shadow. And so there was a very insightful article that was done by a woman named Alexandra Petrie, and it was published in the Washington Post on September 26th. Now, I'll just read the biological information about Alexandra Petrie first. Alexandra Petrie is a Washington Post columnist offering a lighter take on the news and opinions of the day. She is the author of A Field Guide to Awkward Silences. Okay, so she is a kind of cultural commentator. But as we talk about the shadow, and this is something that I was not well taught in my liberal arts college, even though it should have been taught, and that is that we're talking about the same type of issue as Jekyll and Hyde. Okay, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that's one. And another is Faust, and by Goethe, and by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And so think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Those were two men who were actually one man. And so what Ms. Petrie has done is written an article that sort of parallels the Jekyll and Hyde story, but she does it in the context of Judge Brett Kavanaugh and his doppelganger shadow figure, Bart O'Kavanaugh. And so I'm not making a judgment about Judge Kavanaugh. I'm simply trying to offer an illustration here about the shadow and about what we all need to recognize about our own shadows so that you can see that. And as you will see at the end of the article, Ms. Petrie also makes no final judgment. She only says, this is one thing, this is the other. And so I'm going to read her article to you. The name, this is from the opinion page of the Washington Post, and it's entitled, Brett Kavanaugh was a model youngster. Bart O'Kavanaugh was not. Brett Kavanaugh did not go out much. He was quiet, respectful lad. His only hobby, more of a passion than a hobby, was to update a meticulous calendar of all of his social outings in case he needed to consult it in 30 or more years. Sometimes, for fun, he would pay a respectful visit to one of the 65 girls his own age, although this was but seldom, as he had a lot of homework and volunteer work and future leadership to do. For fun, he enjoyed reading only the gallant sections of Goofus and Gallant comic strips and saying golly gee whiz in moments of heightened stress. He was a model youngster. It is too bad that his live-in doppelganger, Bart O'Kavanaugh, was not, but perhaps that was the only way things could have been. Brett was so complete in his purity that he once healed a junior's hangover with merely a touch of his hand. On the single occasion he attended a party, Brett turned the keg to water and gave everyone fish and loaf snacks. Bart, meanwhile, seemed possessed of a more human strength. There were certain odd facets to him that his friends tried not to call notice to. He only had a shadow sometimes. No one had ever seen his feet. When the class dove was confided to his care, it died immediately. Sometimes you would be startled to find him in the locker room because the echoes of his voice there did not carry. Bart was on the football team and the basketball team. It was nice having a doppelganger because that way Bart could play football on Brett's behalf and Brett did not have to worry about getting head injuries. It had been a good idea to summon him. Only having a shadow sometimes was a small price to pay. Bart was well liked by his peers, especially Mark Judge, although Brett knew better than to question the judgment of someone who literally had Judge in his last name. He could not help but worry that Bart might say or do something that would have consequences for both of them down the line. Sometimes he tried to bring this up with his doppelganger without much success. "Excited for my wholesome weekend," he said timidly, watching as Bart tied his shoes and belched noisily. "I hope you stay safe out there, Bart. Remember, you only have one brain, and I have a pamphlet here that shows you what the brain becomes on drugs." Bart snorted and crumpled the pamphlet. Bart never said much. He mainly communicated by downing kegs. 1 keg meant yes, 3 kegs could mean anything. Brett was half in awe and half terrified of him. Bart was tan and half an inch taller. Sometimes when Bart was indulged to an even greater degree, Brett thought he could feel himself shrinking, his voice growing softer, his skin more translucent, but he dispensed with the thought. It would be no good to be paranoid. Bart was never paranoid. Bart was not afraid of anything, least of all consequences. Bart never went to church, although Brett always invited him to go, saying he would be happy to attend an earlier or a later service. "Have an extra respectful weekend," Brett wrote in his calendar. He was already dreading the moment he would have to go out with the car and pour Bart into the back seat, give him water and Tylenol, and put him to bed, as happened most weekends. Boys will be boys, he reminded himself. They seldom argue, though mostly Brett did not have the nerve. The only exception to this was once when Brett had returned from one of his platonic visits to a respected female friend. He noticed Bart at their desk scrawling on their shared yearbook page. Brett stammered, adjusting his uniform collar. Bart squinted up at him. I must have understood, I guess, but I kind of, I thought I could write, thought I would get to write the yearbook page. Bart shook his head. Brett tiptoed over to see what the page said. There was a lot about kegs, which could not be helped. The page also included the phrase, "Have you boofed yet?" "Have you boofed yet?" Brett asked timidly. "What is boofed? Is this something we'd definitely like to have on the page?" Bart nodded. Brett kept reading. "Renate alumnius." Renate was the name of one of his 65 respected female friends. "See here, Bart," he said, then cleared his throat, which had gone suddenly dry. "See here, oh, that's not, I don't think that's a nice implication." Bart chuckled. "Renate's going to be real upset if she sees this," Brett said. He clenched one hand, denting the calendar he always carried in case it needed updating. "Golly gee whiz, Bart. Golly gee whiz." Bart grunted menacingly at him, and Brett decided to leave well enough alone. That night, in their bedroom, Bart slept in the bed. Brett shunted himself underneath. He began to wonder about the rest of their shared life. Was Yale going to be like this too? Probably Bart would join some sort of frat immediately and leave Brett to do their homework and get them ready for law school. Then life? Brett had a plan. He would become a clerk, then work in the White House, then become a judge someday with clerks of his own. Female clerks he could show respect to, as had been his hobby for so long. Then maybe someday join the Supreme Court. There were calendars upon calendars, all planned out to the day, but if Bart continued to carry on as he had, what would become of them? Most people did not even know he had a doppelganger, he thought. If Bart suffered an accident, no, it would not be right to harm his doppelganger. Gallant would frown on such immorality. They were the kinds of thoughts Bart would think. Bart, atop the covers, shifted. The thought began to congeal in the back of his mind that Brett was no fun anymore. He tried to remember whether Brett had ever been fun. Thinking and remembering were great efforts. The room was lurching back and forth the way it usually did between his third and fourth keg stands. Brett never drank, and he had not even been to Beach Week a single time. Brett was dead weight. He breathed too loudly under the bed and was always pestering him about his brain. Why did he bother dragging Brett around with him? He dropped down off the bed. It is not clear what happened that evening. Some think that only one of them made it out of that room, but which one? I do not know what happened. I am not sure what I believe. Maybe they are still together, yoked by their shared ambition, and one of them still lives with his collection of calendars under the stairs of the well-appointed house and emerges only to squint into bright lights and face questioning, then be shoved back inside. Or maybe one of them was a thing that happened at Georgetown Prep and stayed at Georgetown Prep. All I know is that all these things I hear these days cannot be true at once. Not if there is only one man. I think, rather, there must be two, or have been two. Or if there is only one man, I would like to know which one it is. Okay, so that was by Alexander Petrie. And as you appreciate, she was explicating a fictitious, shall we say, fictitious description of the shadow of the day. Okay, let me go back and look at some things, and then I'm going to talk about one other thing, which is Faust's sin, the sin of modern man. So Thomas says, bringing opposites together, that conjunctio doesn't mean the qualities of each is blended into the other, with each losing its peculiarities and its singularities, does it? Who would want that? And of course that is correct, Thomas, because one of the opposites is, for we men, that one of the opposites is woman. And most men would say vive la différence, and you can't be whole without understanding your feminine side, which is one of the reasons why we marry. And it's one of the reasons why I have a coffee cup that says, if a man speaks in the desert and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the answer to that question is yes, he is, because he has not heard from his feminine side. And the conjunctio is bringing the feminine side into the wholeness of your life. And it's about bringing the shadow into the wholeness of your life. And so I don't make any criticism of Judge Kavanaugh by reading this article, because I don't know him at all, and I don't know what's true. Other people do. But I venture that all human beings have had some sort of adventure along these lines, especially people who've been in the United States in the last 60 or 70 years. And so the question is, where is the red line, and what is reasonable and what is not reasonable? And each of us must make our own decision, but keep in mind that each of us has a doppelganger, just like the one that was described, or not just like the one that was described in that piece, but we all have one, and we need to recognize that shadow and incorporate it into our life and the way we live our lives. Sean says, can you talk more about the conjunctio? First, I've heard about it. Miracles with faith. I like Goethe. Haha. Great symbolism in this story. I'm not going to talk about the conjunctio in great detail here, because that is a topic that Dr. Jung wrote a book this thick on, and the book is called Mysterium Conjunctionis. At some point in the next year or two, I will address that book, and I may address an abbreviated discussion of conjunctio. I'm hoping to begin a discussion of alchemy and psychology, or psychology and alchemy, at some point here soon after I complete the Dream series. But it's such a complex topic that I simply can't address it here today. Ryan says, really cool story. Thomas says, a person incapable of seeing the shadow would be incapable of making any sort of progress along the road to self-knowledge. He would never see a flaw in himself. He would never grow, but his ego, huge. And Sean says, or it could be like the story of Job, a tragic learning, and sounds like the shadow is anxiety in this story. Yeah, that's a little simplistic, but okay. I did read Dr. Jung's chapter on the shadow, which is in the readings on from Ion, and it is chapter 2 of Ion, so you could read that if you like. Thomas says, I see my shadow every day. Whenever something in another person charges me up or annoys me, I have learned to pause, stop, and ask myself, how am I like this person? What in that other is in me? And that's specifically Dr. Jung's recommendation. Everything that annoys us about someone else is in us, and it is our shadow. And Thomas says, a great article from the Post. Bardo Kavanaugh was a person in Kavanaugh's friend Mark Judge's memoir, Wasted Tales of a Gen X Drunk. Most people think Bart is Brett. Well, I don't know if Bart is Brett. I'm only reading Ms. Petrie's article to explain, to help the followers of this channel understand what the shadow is and how serious it is. Grenade says, I think there are a lot of animus-possessed women nowadays. For example, the militant lesbians, maybe because a weakened fatherly presence. Well, Grenade, I'm not going to analyze women in that way. And I'm not a mental health professional, so I think that you may be a little bit too cavalier in your analysis there. So anyway, okay. So one more thing, and that is I want to talk about the Faustian sin, which is the sin of the modern age. And in order to do that, we first have to talk about Dr. Jung's interest in gardening and potato farming. And Dr. Jung was very emphatic that we need to have something which connects us back to our natures. Okay, and that's a very important aspect of this archetype of the self, which is if the archetype of the self is in us all, which it is, then how do you recognize and how do you get back to it? And Dr. Jung did a lot of things, a lot of primitive things to reconnect him with his nature, his own self. So the first thing I want to do today is talk to you about how I connect myself, one of the ways I connect myself to my self. Okay, so here is the ingredients of a curry that I made today for my wife and I. And so all the ingredients that you see, I normally make a vegetarian curry. And so all the ingredients that you see here are in our curry. And so in the process of this, let me say that in connecting myself up with my nature, it is within the nature of males to do certain things for females as a mating ritual. And so if I take the osprey that live in great numbers outside my home, for example, these are seahawks, and they do three things when they're in their mating process. One of them is that they have to make a nest. The male makes a nest. Number two, the male has to bring the female a fish. So he has to bring her food, and that's because during the egg laying and hatching period of 40 days, she's entirely dependent upon him to feed her. And number three, he then does a sky dance with her where they fly around each other in a certain way that is suggestive to an osprey. But I believe that the feeding function and taking women out to a restaurant to eat is within the context of an archetype like that, a mating ritual. And I find also that I can make my wife very happy by two things that I do. And these are things that connect me up with my nature and with that part of my nature which involves feeding my wife. One of the things that I do is that every morning during the work week and almost every day, I prepare an omelet for my wife, and we both enjoy it. I used to make cheese omelets. Nowadays I make omelets that have fresh vegetables in them. But I do that every day, and my recipe is to put 2 eggs in a measuring cup, then fill the quantity of mixture up to 3/4 of a cup with egg beaters. Okay, so it's overemphasizing the egg white, and then I'm putting 1/4 of a cup of milk in it. So the ultimate mixture for the two of us is 1 cup. I then mix that up very well and drop that into a heated fry pan, and then I sprinkle fresh salsa over that as it starts to cook on the one side. And I find that process very satisfying. And I don't know why, but I think it does connect me up with my unconscious nature. And so the other thing that I do in the wintertime especially is that I create a curry. And as you see, this is the curry. And I wanted to show you one other picture, but I don't have it quite prepared yet. So just give me a moment and I'll hopefully show it to you. I thought I was going to have it, but then I got delayed, and so I didn't get the image off my computer yet, but I will have it in 10 seconds here. Okay, so just a minute. I have a huge image apparently, so I have to reduce its size so I can get it onto the screen. Here it comes. Okay, so here I am a couple of hours ago, and what I find very satisfying is cutting up all the vegetables. So here you see I'm with my large butcher knife, and I simply, I find it very peaceful and satisfying to use this knife to chop these things up in this way. It's a very chopping and cutting things with knives is a very manly thing to do, so I find it very good in my nature to do that. And so I say that because not everybody uses the same method to reach their natural self. And so now I'm going to read to you a brief passage from this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And so this is I'm reading a portion. This is a portion of an essay by Dr. Andrei Schweitzer entitled Encountering the Spirit of the Depths and the Divine Child. But this is only a portion of this essay, but it first refers to Dr. Jung and what he did to get back to nature. And he did many things. He did gardening. He built a stone house that he never had plumbed nor electrified. So he lived in a very medieval way when he was at that house. And it always made him feel much closer to his soul. And so let me read what he says and what Dr. Schweitzer says here. Now he's quoting Jung. Quote, "I return to my small garden that presently blooms and whose extent I can measure. It shall be well tended. The future should be left to those of the future. I return to the small and the real, for this is the great way, the way of what is to come. I return to my simple reality, to my undeniable and most minuscule being." Unquote. Then and of course, Dr. Jung was in Switzerland during both World Wars, and he and his wife, who was the daughter of the third wealthiest man in Switzerland, were relegated to growing their own vegetables during these war periods. And there was one raucous description of them going to Bollingen, which was the house that he built, and they had to push their own cart to get their belongings from their main home in Küsnacht, which is a suburb of Zurich, to Bollingen, a distance of about 15 miles. And so here are these two nearly 70-year-old people pushing this cart during World War II. So then Dr. Schweitzer goes on. I returned to, quote, I returned to my small garden that presently blooms, unquote, is an illusion and clear antithesis of the Faustian hubris that deeply concerned Jung throughout his entire life. Beside the big tower in Bollingen, along with the kitchen on the ground floor and the two small dormitories on the first floor, is a small tower that Jung added 8 years later in 1935. This is the so-called chapel, Jung's place of meditation. Above the entrance door of this chapel, chiseled into the arch, we read, Philomonas Sacrum, Fausti Penitentia. The sacred place of Philemon, the atonement of Faust. So whenever Jung entered the chapel to meditate, he was reminded of Faust's sin. But what is his sin? Even though I am aware that the beautiful story of Philemon and Baucis, as recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, is well known, some stories are so true that they bear repeating again and again, so I offer it here once more. Quote, Jupiter and Mercury, Zeus and Hermes, decided to come down to earth, wandering around disguised as peasants. Wherever they knocked and begged for shelter, they were haughtily turned away. Finally, when they came to the miserable hut of an old couple, Philemon and Baucis, they found an open door. The old people welcomed them and served them a meal. When they wanted to slaughter their only goose for their guests, the goose sought shelter in the lap of one of the visitors and thus was spared from being slaughtered. It was only much later, when Philemon and Baucis saw that the wine jar was refilled magically, that they recognized their divine visitors. The gods rewarded them by granting them a wish. And the two asked to stay together until death and even afterward. Thus, when they died, the humble cottage was changed into a magnificent temple where the two served as priest and priestess. Unquote. So again, what is Faust's sin and what is the sin of modern man? At the end of Faust II, Faust, in order to increase his properties, carries out his megalomaniac plans with great ambition and with an inflated consciousness. In the midst of these properties, however, there was still that small place, including the garden and the chapel on Philemon and Baucis. And the chapel of Philemon and Baucis. Faust was annoyed at the sound of the church bells of these pious people. Thus he gave an order to Mephistopheles to get rid of them, whereupon Mephistopheles immediately killed the old couple, which was not exactly Faust's conscious intention. In the epilogue of Psychology and Alchemy, Jung dealt with that Faustian hubris. He said, with a side glance to Nietzsche's Zarathustra, quote, "In his blind urge for superhuman power, Faust brought about the murder of Philemon and Baucis. An inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing else but its own existence," unquote. Ever since the Age of Enlightenment and in the era of scientific rationalism, the psyche had become synonymous with consciousness. There was no psyche outside the ego. Therefore, Jung continued, we must repudiate the arrogant claim of the conscious mind to be the whole of the psyche, and to admit that the psyche is a reality which we cannot grasp with our present means of understanding. The problem of modern man is, as Jung saw it, his God Almightiness. In German, it's Gottseligkeit. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce German. That is, the identification of the ego with the objective psyche, or the divine. We may say as well that the sin of modern man is his inflation. As the Red Book strongly suggests, as long as we are unwilling to return to poverty for the sake of the God, and as long as we are unwilling to accept the burden of our spiritual poverty, then despite all our material wealth, there will remain a lack of inner happiness. Up to his old age, Jung was attracted to the simple life in the midst of nature. Only a few years after his descent to the depths in the Red Book, in 1923, he started to build the tower at Bollingen. Whenever his schedule would allow, he lived a rather primitive life there, with no electricity and no running water. He cooked all the meals on the open fire. There he felt at home, connected with the spirit of the depths. From the beginning, he said in his memoirs, quote, I felt the tower as in some way a place of maturation, a maternal womb or a maternal figure in which I could become what I was, what I am, and will be. At Bollingen, I am in the midst of my true life. I am most deeply myself. Here I am, as it were, the age-old son of the mother. Indeed, the spirit of the depths forced him down to the last and simplest things. In the Tower of Bollingen, living a most simple life, Jung had materialized these last and simplest things. This was the place he felt nearest to the soul. So, I've been reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arst. This is from Volume 1 of the free three-volume set, and I've been reading from the essay by Dr. Andrei Schweitzer, Encountering the Spirits of the Depths and the Divine Child. And so, now I will go back and look at your comments. Okay, let's see. Thomas says, my daughter is a lesbian. On my birthday, she wrote me a card saying, you were my best friend. And Grenade says, that's great, Thomas. Thomas says, I worked at night and had to stay home taking care of her while my wife worked, so we bonded. She's 36 and works at a nonprofit. Great coffee cup. Wow. Sean Steele says, Skip, I think you should go back to where you had the Japanese screen divider. It had a certain energy that draws in more people. Okay, that's a valuable comment, Sean. I'll consider that. I do have those dividers, obviously, but I'll have to consider doing that. Grenade says, it's funny, in some cultures cooking is seen as a manly activity, like in Louisiana it is traditional for the men to cook. It's interesting. Then they teach their sons some of the best food I've ever had. And I would just recommend to you a movie that we saw some time ago called The Chef. It's very good. And Grenade says, I was from Louisiana. I'm not saying women can't cook, of course. I just prefer the Cajun-style taste. Thomas, Cajun food is good for sure. Thomas, I'm inspired by your omelet story, Skip. I can cook well, but I don't do it often. I know my wife will be happily shocked tomorrow morning. Well, I would also comment that it is traditional in my family in this sense that whenever my father was available in the house, because he was a naval officer, so he was a few times on deployment and not available. But when he was home, he would always make pancakes on Sunday morning. It was a great family tradition. And so anyway, for all the young men here, and believe it or not, there's 97% of the people that follow this YouTube channel are young men between the ages of 18 and 34. So that's 97% of the subscribers to this YouTube channel. And therefore, I wanted to offer my advice in terms of cooking. And I suppose I ought to go back to my curry image just for a minute. So that I can give you my recipe. Okay, so here's my recipe. You get at least 10 vegetables and fruits. And as you see here, I have an eggplant, a pineapple, green and yellow squash, and at least 3 very colorful peppers. I have 3 kinds of spicy peppers. There's a banana pepper, there's a green pepper, and there's a little red pepper there. I don't remember its name. There's also a green tomato. I have 3 onions in that. There's an apple, and there are shiitake mushrooms. And so my process is to cut everything up, and I have to make 2 batches because my mother-in-law can't stand spicy food. And so I got 2 kinds of curry. One is hot Madras curry, and the other is just normal Madras curry. And so I make it in 2 buckets, as you see the one here. And what I do is I cut it all up. I put a half a cup of chicken broth in the main container here, and then I simmer that for 1 to 2 hours. Then we also we separately saute the onions, the peppers, and the last thing we cut up is the apple, and that is put in last for sweetness. And so we simmer that on a low heat for at least an hour. 2 is better, and then we prepare a quantity of rice that we think we can eat in the evening, and we serve the concoction that we've made. There's no specific concoction. I simply go through in today's case, I went through a farmer's market and picked whatever vegetables attracted me. But usually I do have an eggplant and a pineapple at the minimum. And I normally do have onions and mushrooms. But otherwise, I just go with the flow and take at least 10 items. This is a Japanese tradition that you'll keep your health if you eat 10 things in a day. And we simmer that, and then when the rice is ready, we serve this concoction over the rice. And what that does is that gives us then a meals for the next week, which is very much appreciated by the ladies. And so I would urge you, and if you're trying to impress a young woman to become your wife, you might try my recipe. But make sure you try it on yourself first so you know how it is, because hot Madras curry is hot, and you have to know the taste of your audience. But I can tell you that my wife, who does work daily at the hospice, very much appreciates the fact that I make a curry every so often in the wintertime, and that basically feeds us for a week. So anyway, that's Skip the chef. That's as much as I do. So this has been a long presentation, longer than I intended, but nonetheless, I think we've covered some valuable material here, and so I hope you'll go back and give it a listen again and let me know of any comments. Please join our advanced reading group, which you can join by writing to me at skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will give you access to our advanced reading group Dropbox. We currently have 28 members, and the letter that I read today was from one of our advanced group members, so I know him pretty well. So anyway, thank you very much. Now I have to go cook the curry, so I have to get out of this live stream for the moment. And I'll see you all, I hope, tomorrow night for the session 3 of the Dream series. So that's what we'll be talking about tomorrow night. Thank you for joining me. Goodbye.